Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another great edition of MASSP's Leader to Leader. If I have not met you before, my name is Wendy Zidab. I'm the Executive Director at the Michigan Association of Secondary School Principals. And as people are rolling in to join today's webinar, I see we're up to about 85 and we're expecting around 200 of our closest friends. So if you would, just put your name and your school and your role in the chat. It's always good for our panelists to know who's with us today. I'm sure they kind of like getting that perspective. Generally speaking, with secondary school principals, we have middle school and high school people from all over the state. But of course, we opened up this webinar to all educators, knowing that there's so much that's going to be shared today that would be beneficial, whether you're a school social worker or a psychologist or an administrator. We wanted everybody to be able to participate. So today we are kind of on part two. On Tuesday, we were fortunate to have Kevin Sutton, a law attorney from Miller Johnson, share with us, kind of some things that we need to be thinking about as administrators, about as these threats come in, how should we be handling it? Certain seizure questions as well. So those were all covered on Tuesday. We also were by the state police, who shared some information with us about okay to say and the importance of getting that information. So that recording will be sent out and made available. Today, we are kind of getting into part two, which is crisis response. And in surveying the landscape of who's doing a nice job with a crisis response, certainly knowing no district has every answer and has everything figured out. But knowing that Ann Arbor has a lot of really good pieces in place, I reached out to my friend and colleague, Paul DeAngelis from Ann Arbor, and he assembled a team of colleagues. Liz Margolis, Corey McAmeel, and Jonathan Stern are all going to be joining from Team Ann Arbor, and they'll be sharing kind of their crisis response protocols, training that they have in place, and maybe even some things that they have planned moving forward. Following Team Ann Arbor, we're going to be joined by Roberta Flachier and Shannon Underwood, who are going to be talking to us a little bit about what can we be doing in terms of climate and culture to just, really make sure that we're connecting with kids, that we're doing good things within our school community, and also thinking a little bit about crisis response as well. So we're looking forward to hearing from them. We have all the panelists' names at the start of these slides so that you'll be able to access that afterwards. And yes, as always, we are recording right now. So you want to share this with another colleague that wasn't able to participate, you can count on doing that. So I'm going to do the slide to Paul DeAngelis. And as Paul's doing that, I just want to remind everyone that in the chat, we strictly use the chat for making comments or saying hello to others. But if you want a question, please make sure that you put that in the Q&A, and I will be monitoring that so that we can pose questions to our panelists as we go. The panelists are also going to be watching the Q&A. So if it's just like a reference or a link or something, their colleagues might be able to pop that in. And if it's actually a question of the panel, I'll pose that. Thanks so much, Paul. I appreciate you kicking things off.
No problem. I think I still need share rights. So maybe I have them now here. So let me get this started. Thank you, everyone. And appreciate, Wendy, you reaching out and happy to share. I guess I want to start by saying what you've already said. We don't have this all figured out. I'm going to tell a little bit of a story about us being a district in crisis several years ago. And I'm already screwing up my PowerPoint here. Hold on one sec. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how we were a district in crisis and how we had some real significant work to do to become better at responding to a crisis. I know for many people, just talking about these issues and talking about what would we do if we had a kid in crisis is very raw. It's very real based on what happened last week. I don't know anything more than anybody else knows, and I haven't been privy to any other information about what happened in Oxford last Tuesday. But I do just want to talk through a story or tell a story of the work that we've done to hopefully avoid a significant issue happening in one of our schools in Ann Arbor. So let me just tell a little bit of a story about Ann Arbor. We have 3 comprehensive high schools, Huron, Pioneer, and Skyline. We have 2 smaller high schools, Community and Pathways, 5 middle schools, 2 K-8s, 19 elementaries, a preschool. We're a big district, 4th largest in the state of Michigan. We have over 17,000 students in our fall count. And what makes it a little bit complicated sometimes, and Liz is a master of dealing with all of this, but we deal with 8 municipalities and 4 different law enforcement agencies, if you include the police department at the University of Michigan. So sometimes being in a crisis can be complicated, just figuring out, are we sending the sheriff's department out to somebody's house, or is it the Ann Arbor Police Department? Is it the Ypsi Police Department? Sometimes we get confused by, or not confused, but sometimes those are some challenges that that we need to overcome. Again, I'm joined by Liz Margolis, who is our Executive Director for Student and School Safety. Corey McAmeel is with us. He's the principal of Skyline High School, and Jonathan Stern, who has been a long time and very, very valuable member of our district crisis team. And they're here really just to be able to answer the questions that I know I won't always be able to answer as we go through and explain some of the work that we've done to just get better at responding in crisis. So in 2016-17, and this is a little bit of our story and why we've done quite a bit of work in this area, we lost 10 students in one school year. It started with a murder in September. It ended with a suicide of a student in Corey's building, actually, in May. And we were a district in crisis. And so that summer, we reached out to all the partners who had come to us throughout the year to help us deal with some of these really, really tough situations that we had in our school buildings. Washtenaw County Community Health came to the table, members of the staff at the School of Psychiatry, the medical director and others from Psych Emergency Services at the University of Michigan. The Washtenaw ISD stepped up, Holly Hevlin, who's been a great partner of ours for a long time. I know a lot of you know Holly. The Ann Arbor Police Department, the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Department, and really key in all of this. And shortly after this, and I know many of you know Elizabeth Koshman through her work with Trails. She's a parent in our district, and she was at the table and really was instrumental in helping us come up with a system for responding. And that's kind of what I want to share with you today. So in a matter of 3 months, from August to October, we knew we had some work to do. And with Elizabeth's help and with the help of a lot of people, we put together a student risk management protocol. We use the Columbia Suicide Screener in that protocol. And we trained in one afternoon. We started this early in the school year and then continued that training through the fall of that 17-18 school year. We trained every administrator, every counselor, and every support staff in that protocol. And within that protocol, we've created not only two-way communication with Psych Emergency Services, but we redrafted all of our crisis response protocols, all of our communications. When we have a crisis in a building, and we've had 3 student deaths already this year, Liz has all of the protocols, all of the communications, and she and I take point on all of those responses, and we do it the same way. We make sure we're doing it the way, there's always something unique that happens in those situations, but we try to do everything based on the training that we've put all of our support staff through. We also took one additional step, and this was with the help of community mental health, but we trained dozens of members of our team across our administrators, our counselors, and our support staff in CISM, Critical Incident Stress Management, which is the same training that law enforcement officials go through. I put down here at the bottom, because this is one of the pieces that we're working on now, and it is just something I wanted to point out. Liz may be able to share some more details about this information later, but the question has come up about a risk assessment when the harm is not to self, but the harm may be to others. And as a county led by, again, Holly Hevland and many others in Washtenaw County, Liz being one of them, we are in the process of adopting a new threat assessment. We have 2 different tools that we currently use, but we're looking at not only across our district, but across the county in using the Dewey Cornell threat assessment. So if you have any questions about that, we can certainly answer those as we and when we get to toward the end of the presentation. So I say this all the time. I'm proud of the work we do every day to support our students. You know, just like anywhere else, we have students that are in crisis every single day. And unfortunately, mental health crisis, or mental health triage, I should say, is the responsibility of schools. And we knew we just needed to do a better job of that. And I can't overemphasize how proud I am of the work that our counselors, our psychologists, our social workers, our administrators, our teachers do every day to triage mental health. And the process that we have in place not only helps us do a better job of that, but then helps those students move to a medical professional, a healthcare provider that can do the medical part of that, the work that we as educators aren't trained to do. So whether their action signals self-harm or harm to others, we're very fortunate to have very well-trained people. We've invested a lot of time in this, and it makes a difference. It makes a difference every single day. And our assessment protocol, again, it's supported by all of our partners, community mental health. If we have a student, just like we did yesterday in a particular building, we had a student who was in crisis, and part of our protocol, when we know that a referral is going to happen to psych emergency services, we contact community mental health, and they have a 24-hour crisis hotline, and they'll either do that virtually or they'll send somebody directly to one of our buildings to help us assess that student so that we can give the parent and psych emergency services all of the information they need to best serve that student. Let me flip to the next slide here. So once we begin our process, and again, I want to preface everything I'm about to say that I'm not trying to judge anything that happened in Oxford. I'm just telling you how we do things here in Ann Arbor. If we start the process because we believe that a student is exhibiting concerning behaviors, we follow that process from beginning to end. There is never a point in time where we stop the process until we've gone through every single step. We don't stop. So once we have identified a student that is exhibiting concerning behaviors, that student remains in our supervision. That's first and foremost. And I'm not saying that anybody else doesn't do that. I'm just saying that's the most important piece of what we do. We contact parents. The student is never sent back to class. We establish for our parents the urgency that we have around supporting this student. We determine things from the parent, their understanding of their well-being, whether this student has been in counseling or therapy. Oftentimes we know this because we've dealt with the student before, or we've been supporting the student for a long time. But if it's a new student, we're gathering as much of that information as we possibly can as we go through our protocols and begin our assessment of the student. We assess whether that student is a risk to their self or a harm to others. And this always includes asking questions about access to weapons and drugs, especially if it's about harm to self. We ask the weapons and drugs, and obviously if we believe that the student is exhibiting behaviors that may be harmful to others, we're asking those questions about access to weapons. I noted reasonable suspicion here, and I think Kevin covered that on Tuesday about when can you search a student, when can't you search a student. We always just err on the side of we're gonna search if we have any reason to believe that the student has a weapon or has access to a weapon. And then I'm going to go through this, and then I'll certainly turn it over to my partners to answer any questions and fill in some of the gaps. When we need to remove a student from school, we have a process called emergency removal. The student is removed from school, and really there's three parts of that. We ask the parents or guardians to have the student evaluated. If we believe the student is a threat to themselves or others, that comes out in the Columbia Suicide Screener or in the threat assessment, and we immediately contact community mental health, their crisis team, to come in and support us. And prior to that student then coming back, the work of our professionals at the building level to develop a care plan for that student. How will we bring that student back? What are the steps that we're going to put in place to provide additional interventions for that student really becomes the priority for us, because once we've turned that student over to a medical professional or a healthcare professional, our work is really spent, our time is spent on the work of putting together a care plan so that student can come back to us, be successful, be safe, not only for themselves, but to others. And then we have a reentry meeting with the student, our support staff, the parents or guardians, and we begin the process of establishing communication with the parents, expectations for the student, and an understanding of how we will care for that student. Let me stop there and to ask Liz or Corey or Jonathan to add anything to this. I do have a copy of the form too that I can show people, but anybody want to add?
I can, Paul, just add in and respond.
We did have a question in the chat, Paul.
It looks like maybe my internet was delayed enough that maybe
I'm sorry, Corey, did you want to have a response?
Yeah, I was responding, but it looks like my Wi-Fi might be like delayed just a little bit. So every time I start to talk, then I see your delay. So I'll answer that one real quickly. It talks in the Q&A with the emergency removal of protocol. If a parent is being required to give an evaluation from a medical healthcare professional, is the school obligated to pay for it? In that question, I think what we don't necessarily worry about is the obligation so much as getting the parents the support they need to assess the student. And so if a parent has a challenge with meeting that need, then we're going to connect them with a ROS clinic or a free assessment opportunity through our community mental health connections, or the connections that we've built through our community partners, our WISD, community mental health, and our other organizations that we partner with. The goal would be really to remove barriers for parents in the assessment process. If there's a mental health concern, we want to really support the family in getting the assessment that's needed and ensuring that there's a safe support plan for the student.
Well said, Corey.
We also had a question. We had a question posed in the chat. What are your protocols when a parent refuses outside evaluation or assessment? And I realize that a lot of these are individualized, but if you have a general response to that.
Corey, do you want to take that one or do you want me to?
I'll take it, Paul, and then if I leave anything off, you feel free to add it in. And then if my Wi-Fi is still being a problem, you let me know too. Typically, we've definitely had parents respond and refusal. The first thing is going to be to walk them through the concern in a very shoulder-to-shoulder manner. I think the first thing anytime when we're working with parents and their child is that identification of mental health needs. We all respond to that in different ways. We all have our precious child that is this diamond, this snowflake, this perfect thing that we want to be everything and beautiful. And so we have to understand that when a parent is dealing with mental health concerns with their child, that's going to be maybe shocking, 2, challenging to deal with, and 3, like an area where they might want to kind of throw their hands up in the air and not know what to do. And so just understand that you should expect a response sometimes that's going to need additional support around it. And so the way that we do is first just walk them through what that means, why, and the reasons why behind we're requesting that. The next would be as we do work to put some teeth behind that. We're going to use that emergency removal process and possibly some other limitations within the building. And those limitations wouldn't be done to be punitive to the child, but put them in a safe environment. And often those types of limitations that we'd have to add into a plan for a student would be one that a parent would also want their child to not have to experience, especially with the mental health concerns they're dealing with. Well, we want to be able to have them experience that full experience of school where we wouldn't have to have reduced services based on concerns for needs. And so we work with the parent to understand that and receive those services. Paul, anything I missed?
No, that was a great answer again, Corey. So thank you. This is always challenging, right? I mean, we've all sat in the assistant principal or principal seat and dealt with that parent who is resistant to the work that we're trying to do to support the student or the discipline that we're trying to impose. And when it comes to mental health, harm to themselves, harm to others, it's often very difficult to receive. But I think we've tried to train our staffs staff to hold their ground. And when we know it's the right thing to do for students, we know that we're going to do the right thing for students. And even if that means going through a difficult period with a parent, like Corey said, we'll get shoulder to shoulder with you, and we'll stress. And I think on the slide there, I emphasize that we want to make sure parents understand the urgency we feel for helping their student. And I think once we've established that, we begin to break down some of those barriers. Jonathan, anything you want to add? You probably have this conversation with challenging parents more often than even Corey or me or Liz, but anything you would want to add to how you respond to a parent who may be challenging us on an assessment like this?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts as we were talking. It is not the typical situation that we get into a crisis with a student that we know nothing about. Typically we've been providing service and creating relationships with both parents and kids, in these kinds of things. And there've been already referrals, or we're looking at the IEP process or the 504 process in ways. And I think that it's really important that we invoke a lot of the values that Mr. McAmill just talked about when dealing with parents all along the way. So when we get to a crisis point, there's already been some trust, and there's already been some, fidelity in the work that we've done, so that parents are usually pretty responsible when we get to that. It really has a lot to do with being faithful to our processes and making sure that we are consistent and using the tools that are available to us. Because it kind of takes away from a lot of that, rapid, sort of decision-making from the seat of our pants. We're really working through a structure that you've described, Mr. D'Angelis, really well. And I think that a lot of what work has been done in Ann Arbor is to standardize our responses to these things, but not in a way that takes away clinical judgment or what we know in context. So that we really are pointing students and families in the right direction to get the kind of service they need. So we don't encounter really strong resistance. The resistance can just be like, I don't want to spend 6 hours in, the ER waiting for to find out that my kid isn't going to be admitted. We get that, but you need to be in front of somebody who can do the assessment that has to be done, and your child's safety is what we're concerned about. And actually, that's something that I always communicate once we hear about a kid in crisis, is everything I do and everything I say from this point on is to increase your safety. So we do that with the student, and we do that with the parent as well.
And then, Paul, if I could just add in, the way Jonathan has explained is, of course, the ideal, right? And what we hope to build, the structure, the communication, the relationship with each of our families. And often we're able to do that. And then we know that there's some families we miss the mark with, right? And there isn't that compliance. And so just what I want to encourage everyone to remember is your next step in the case that you have a student that is a concern of harm to themselves or others, at the final string is a CPS report, completing your 3200 and involving your local police department. At a point where we've expressed a strong concern of a student's well-being to their parents, and they're not following through with the mental health supports and needs that a child needs, that is your time where you are concerned that child is being neglected, and it could be a harm to themselves or others, whether it's in your school environment or once they leave your building. And so that's a valid report. And that's something that I would always do in the case that I could not have a parent follow up. Likely, if it's at that case, I'm calling APD to meet me at the building, and I'm doing a physical handover of student to police department for assessment if parent refuses.
Paul, could I just add to one of the things that we actually this week ran into, and I'm sure it's happened in other buildings, but because we have a group of students that are on virtual, we're obviously running into situations with students on virtual, emails, behaviors that virtual teachers are noticing, concerns. And so we have to look at that a little bit different right now, because we actually aren't seeing the student face to face. And so we then, we work with both our virtual teaching team as well as a school that student may have already been to in the past and what the history is. But we have also had to engage police on some wellness checks. If the parents are virtual and we don't have as much of the direct contact with them, And so then we work with our partners in law enforcement to also help with that. And so being virtual has added a little bit of a different wrinkle in how we are able to support students as well.
And Wendy, I guess I would maybe just wrap up this portion to just say we're very fortunate in Ann Arbor to have unbelievable partnerships, right? When we know that in schools, relationships matter most, when we're dealing with crises, the relationships that we've established matter most. We get unbelievable support from community mental health. Our partners at the ISD are always there if we need additional supports in some way. The Ann Arbor Police Department, the Sheriff's Department, all of the law enforcement agencies take our concerns very seriously. We are a district without resource officers. We do not have resource officers in our schools. But Liz can attest to this because it's one of us that typically calls. In a matter of moments, we will have officers in our schools. And if it's a serious crisis, like we had just a couple of weeks ago, we can sometimes have 9 or 10, right, Mr. Stern? 9 or 10 people in our building in a matter of moments because we've established some really, really great relationships with those people. Even with the medical director at Psych Emergency Services, we were dealing with a student who was in crisis just 2 days ago at Huron High School and was seen by the medical director and his team at Psych Emergency Services. And I got a call because they wanted more information on this student before they were willing to release that student. And so we've just tried to keep, since we were really, really in trouble, we felt, in terms of how we were responding and the resources that we needed back in the 16-17 school year. We have just continued to try to build relationships that matter most to us in how we support students and how we support families getting through some really, really challenging times.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing what you've been able to pass along with people today. Liz, I don't know if you can share any information about the threat assessment training that Washtenaw ISD is going to be holding. Just, what you know about it to this point and what that might look like.
Sure. So pre-pandemic, we began to meet as a team, our countywide school districts, as well as our law enforcement teams. And we started, we did this when we instituted the ALICE intruder training. We worked countywide with law enforcement, with every school district. And so we brought that model back together to really talk about a common threat assessment tool. Many districts were using different tools, partial tools, that type of thing. And then we wanted something that also complemented our local law enforcement, who could use the law enforcement end of that tool as well. So we began a process and we started reviewing a variety of different threat assessments available and interviewing with those folks, hearing about how they're implemented. And we did land on the Dewey Cornell process. So we had just brought that to our superintendent and law enforcement panels, and it had been approved, and then the pandemic hit. So we are just now gathering back with our teams and looking for some additional funding that we had actually already secured, but now we need to secure it over again. And so our plan is to roll out the Dewey Cornell threat assessment process with all of our school districts, as well as the law enforcement end of it. So again, we're coordinating with our local law enforcement partners, and we're all working off the same plate. So it's happening not just district by district, or school by school. We're all using the same tools. And we found that when we did ALICE, that really helped us coordinate, not only within our school districts, but with our law enforcement partners. So we're expecting the same results with Dewey Cornell system. And of course, we will share that as we jump into that here in Washtenaw County. We'll be able to share a lot more about that in the coming months.
That's great. So Corey, can I circle back to you for a minute? When you think about, you've got a pretty big ship you're running there at Skyline. How many students do you have?
We're about 1,400 this year, Wendy.
Okay, so you have a lot going on there. I've been to your building. You've got a lot of doors, a lot of different things that you need to be monitoring and keeping an eye on. So when you're doing Alice training, what does that look like systemically? Not just in, of course, at Skyline, but across Ann Arbor Public Schools. Is this an annual thing? What does the follow-up look like? You know, like retraining, making sure that new people that come on board and subs, what do you have in place for that?
Yeah, great. So, Alice training has been officially in place with 2013 or 14, Liz. I don't want to misspeak. It's been quite some time. About 2014, I believe, was our first training in our intermediate school district. So again, Holly Haviland assisted with some of that and her team over at the WISD, putting together training along with Ann Arbor Police Department, running the full Alice training in scenarios. We did that first in teams through ISD, starting with the administration in the building, central administration, and then trickling down. We then hosted several trainings within my own facility and other school facilities in partnership with our law enforcement for our staff. We reiterate that training every year or every other year, dependent on staff hiring and where we are, the full training with staff, where they're at and joining. Now, of course, during COVID, we've had a little bit of a bump in training times. And so we're reinvigorating that training again as we go. That would be the official full Alice training that I'm speaking about there. We then have what we call refreshers. And so Alice refreshers or safety and security refresher drills happen annually at the building level. Our building administrators initiate a training each year with their staff. And then what we do at the high school level, this happens a little bit differently at each school level. At the high school level, we of course run our regular drills. One of our drills is run as a training drill. We do it fully educationally. We start not just going right into drill. We start by going into what is Alice? What would we do in this room? How would we counter? Where would we evacuate to? What are other places? And then we drill it. But we also do an advisory lesson. This year's advisory lesson, of course, was adapted slightly and because of what occurred in Oxford. And we just recently did that we were scheduled to do it the day following the Oxford tragedy. So we moved that back a week. One of the things we did was take temperature of our students and how they're responding to those events. But then we do go through our Alice protocols with them in more of an advisory setting. We talk about why we do them and what we mean. We also connect them to some of our other school practices and protocols that we do. Like, why do we ask you not to walk around with 2 earbuds in your ears at all times? That's so you can hear us when things like this happen. Why do we ask you not to let kids in a side door? Like you said, you came to my building and, some people will be surprised by this, but I have about 22 doors on my ground level. I have, 12 doors from my commons to the outside that kids could just walk out during lunch and go into any neighborhood they wanted to. So, you have to be really thoughtful about security and environment like that. I'm sure you're all aware. So I want to say with all of that, staff still have concerns. They still have questions. And I think one of the things that's important is we went over again with staff our processes last night. Liz puts together a nice presentation that is a standard district presentation. We play that for our small groups. We gather questions. We respond to the ones we can. We then populate a FAQ doc that Liz responds to for the ones that would be more based on her level of questioning. We use that process to sometimes evaluate what we're doing, right? The questions we receive help us know if what we're doing is working and help us know how we might need to adapt our training. We also use those questions to make sure people feel prepared. I want to say, as much as we do this every single time, I think just yesterday, schools are cyclical. Principals, we're used to this, right? We are always for the rest of our lives going to remind kids to get to class on time, no matter how good we are at reminding kids to get class on time, right? Because we get that new group of freshmen. The same thing happens with Alice and our staff. Like, I had to remind my staff about our door protocol. And they all started kind of getting very anxious about our door protocol. And some of these door protocols can become somewhat unique based on our own buildings. And once we went through that reminder, everything just got a little bit easier. So just one of the things I always remind my team is expect questions, expect anxieties, right? We all have them. And so how do we start to anticipate those questions, get ahead of what our staff is feeling anxious about, and then load our presentations with the questions they have ahead of time. The other thing I'd like to touch on real quick, Wendy, even though you didn't ask me to, is that assessment protocol that Liz spoke to, or the threat piece, is just for years. And I know principals, you have been asked to assess these on your own. We had bomb threats, we had other threats, and you're speaking with fire and police, and they're telling you at the end, it's your call often as to knowing the student best. And we know that's important. Relationships in schools, that's why we talk about staff. That's why we have people in our buildings, knowing our kids and being able to look at Wendy and say, Wendy just doesn't look like Wendy today. I need to touch in with her. That's our greatest defense. And so this protocol that and threat assessment, what it helps us do is it just helps ease some of that tension that you feel in that moment. It standardizes the questions that you would go through. And I'm not going to tell you it's rocket science. You're going to look at these questions, you're going to say, oh yes, this makes sense. But what you're going to do is feel like I wasn't alone in this. It's not just me making this determination, someone who's trained to be a principal and teacher who's now deciding, is there a bomb threat in my facility? And so it really does help you assess that in a way that feels strategic, feels thoughtful, and feels like you have a partner in that work.
Yeah, Wendy, can I just add real quick?
I'll
Do you mind if I add real quick? Corey did give a great
Go ahead.
overview of our Alice. When we do our scenario trainings, and I'm sure many districts do it this way as well, we do an hour classroom training with our group, with our staff, and then we move into an hour scenario. And we have participation from our Ann Arbor Police, the Sheriff's Office, and University of Michigan public service officers come over, and we actually do, usually we get 3 to 4 scenarios in during that training where we do use blanks and we do put them in uncomfortable positions, but that's really when staff understand what their response is and how they need to plan based on that response. And so that type of training has been missed during the pandemic. We are hoping in the spring that we can bring that back for our new staff that haven't gone through that yet. But it's a hard training, but I see it as extremely beneficial. And then just one thing, Corey mentioned bomb threat assessment. That was something we also did do countywide right prior to the pandemic. We realized, everybody knows the spring bomb threats. All schools get their calls, they get their bomb threats because kids want to get outside, that type of thing. And what we learned was that within Washtenaw County, like Ann Arbor, we very rarely, if ever, evacuated if it was a sort of a common assessment threat that we would do. But in other districts, they were evacuating every single day, those schools. And then what they were seeing, of course, was copycats because the kids got what they wanted. So we worked with our local law enforcement in all of our schools in the county and have developed a common bomb threat assessment. And we actually do have those documents and those tools. There was both a law enforcement tool and a school tool just to help guide us through that practice. So we have some consistency of response.
And Wendy, when I send you the PowerPoint, I will send you that bomb threat assessment that we use countywide. I think it would also, because probably a lot of districts, because of the pandemic, haven't done ALICE training the way you would want to do ALICE training. I'd love to share with you the slide deck that Liz just put together. All 32 of our schools yesterday went through a refresher protocol, and I'll include that with the materials that I sent you, along with our risk assessment protocol that includes the Columbia screener.
That is fantastic. I really appreciate that. And I would really like to call upon Team Ann Arbor to join us at EdCon this summer and do a presentation going through this with people in person and really being able to kind of step by step hand out a lot of those things, because I think it would be really beneficial to people as well. So we do have with us today school social worker, Roberta Flachier, and also Shannon Underwood, a school counselor. And, your perspectives are so important to us as well. And I'm knowing that you've been sitting here listening to this, I'm wondering what your next +1 to this might be. I don't know, which one of you wants to jump in first?
I'm back.
Oh, great. Roberta, go ahead.
You knew that was going to happen.
Of course.
Passing time, right? And the music to play, right? Well, I want to thank you for inviting me to join you. I am a general education social worker. I've been here at Mattawan for 19 years. Never thought it would be that long, but I love it here. And it's encouraging to hear the Ann Arbor School District talking about their risk protocols and to know that ours line up. Because we're a very small district, we have, and don't quote me on this, but about 3,000 students. We have one high school, one middle school, an early elementary and a later elementary. So within those schools, we have 5 to 6 full-time social workers. We have about 7 counselors. And here at the high school, I have a team that includes our principal, 2 deans, 3 counselors, myself, and recently we've been assigned, and we're so grateful to have her. I am especially, we have a social work mental health clinician who is now able to do therapy within our building. And that's made a big difference already in terms of addressing students' needs. So she is one person also that can come in and do a suicide mental health assessment for us. And that might also help when we need resources and a parent is reluctant to go outside of school. So when I talked to Colin Ripmaster, he asked me if I could just talk a little bit about what I do under the radar, so to speak, because our program and my role in the building is one that addresses issues that come up with school culture and creating a caring, safe environment for students. And just to give a little background, my position actually was one that a previous social worker had held for about 16 years. And at the time that she was hired, there were a rash of suicide deaths among Southwest Michigan teenagers. And the adults in the schools, the surrounding school districts and counties, so forth, got together and they said, what can we do to prevent needless loss of life among our student population? And they knew then what we still know now, and that is that students will talk to one another when there's a crisis situation. And they usually talk to each other first. We all know that. So out of that was born this program called PALS, Peer Assistance, Leadership, and Service. And when I came on board, the PALS program had been in force for about 16 years. So now we've had this program in our school for about 33 years, from what I can tell. And essentially, it's a evidence-based program. We do an annual survey of students. We ask them if they think that the PALS program helps create a more caring school environment. We also, at that time, asked students to give me the names of 3 students they know and trust who could help them if they were in a serious situation, if they had a serious problem. And so out of that, what happens is students nominate other students that they know. And of course, I have a background actually in social work in a medical setting. At one time, I was a medical social worker at Bronson Hospital. And so I brought that skill set, but at the same time I came in and I thought, is this a popularity contest? Are kids just, is this like homecoming, or, Snow Queen or whatever, not having that orientation from school. And so what I discovered year after year, because I go to rooms and I present the program. I also talk about suicide prevention at the same time. I talk about creating a caring school environment. What I learned is that the students in our school know who the caring people are. And then what happens is I invite those students to apply to this peer helping program called PALS. And then I ask for 2 references from adults in the building who know them. And these, by the way, are students in the 10th, 11th, and 12th grades. We let our freshmen kind of adjust. So then what happens is I go through that list. Sometimes I'll have as many as 90 students apply, and usually my classroom can only hold about 27. It's kind of a small environment. So from there, I'm able to have personal interviews, select the students, and then they stay in that peer helping position once they're trained. So we train first semester, it's just PALS 1, Peer Assistant Leadership and Service, and PALS 2 is called PALS in Action. So the students take a second course. I have a co-teacher. The school graced me with a second semester of PALS. When I taught my first 2 years, I said, there's so much more to learn. We do have a curriculum that we follow. It's actually through a really basic book that teaches basic foundations of communication and psychology. And I'm sitting in my room right now and all my students are working on their group projects down in the comments, but my room is set up so that I have chairs and I don't have desks. So the students sit and face one another and we work on our communication skills. So our students also, what do they do for school climate? They host an annual dance for students at the beginning of the year. That was difficult this year with, of course, with COVID. But every new student to our school gets a tour from one of our students, and that student checks back to see if they're adjusting. We also, in this room, I probably just have to show you with my camera. This is what the school did for us. You'll look, tell me if you can see it. You can see, do you see two doors
Yes.
there?
Yes.
And there's my room. The students decorate it. They decorate. Oh, are you still there?
Yes.
Oh, good, because I can't see you now. I just did something. I'm going to keep talking.
Okay. You're
So,
fine.
so our students, that is really weird. That's never happened to me before. I'm glad you can see me. So our students try to provide a comfortable place where students can drop in. They also, this year, they developed a QR code, which is on a poster within all the bathrooms and on the walls throughout the school. So students can sign up for the PALS room and it's excused for student business. At that time, they can speak to a pal, a trained pal. They can talk to a friend. And of course, I'm available. So sometimes it's pretty busy within this setting because those rooms I just showed you add to, all of the action that's going on, but it's all supervised as well. So part of the reason this program I feel is really important is that I think it's a funnel for all of the other problems that students experience. Students might not be thinking about suicide, but they might be thinking about, I've got a problem with my friend, I need to talk it out. And I don't want to talk about it in the classroom, the hallway, or the lunchroom. So the PALS program provides that environment. It's safe, it's confidential. In fact, all of our students are trained with the same principles that we as social workers and educators follow, which is there's confidentiality. Our PALS take a confidentiality pledge. And we follow, of course, the simple rules that if there's danger to someone, if they're thinking about harming themselves, harming others, or if of course, there's situations like abuse or being harmed outside of school, those are times when all my students all are required to report back to me. And again, I think the program has been a funnel for fielding some of the more what might be minor concerns at first, but that could eventually snowball into other concerns for students, mental health concerns that could ultimately create a situation, which is the reason we're all here, if there's a school-wide crisis. So I should point out, it's really hard for me not to be looking at everybody. I'm an eye contact kind of person, but I'll keep going. I should point out that about 15 years ago, I and another social worker in the district were asked to join a group of school specialists from Kalamazoo and Calhoun County. And we were trained by some of the founding fathers in the CISM for schools, crisis management strategies. To give you just one minor example, just starting, I could just go on and on about this because we've probably had about 15 different crisis situations where we've used this model. One of the ones that probably people in the audience would recognize is when there was a shooting in Kalamazoo. There was a student who died, and this is public, I'm not revealing any private info. Tyler Smith was shot and killed at a car dealership. He was one of our students. And the way that things work with my peer helping program is that goes way back, I taught my students what I was being trained for. I told them about crisis response. This is what it looks like. And the very first crisis we had, I was really surprised there were students waiting in the office to assist the adults. And they delivered passes, they delivered surveys, they were extremely helpful. And unfortunately, because we had so many of those responses, what happened over the years is that the PALs got really good at assisting. Now, they don't do crisis debriefings, but they are in the hallways. They direct students to where they might go. If there's a quiet room or a support room, they let them know that there'll be support offered in school. Over the years, they have developed this and kind of passed along the skill set to the students who come when they leave the school. So with Tyler Smith, what happened was we got word on a Saturday night. By Sunday morning, my students were actually texting me and saying, we'd like to know how we can assist, what we can do. And we organized a group of 22 PALs, peer helping students, who came into our school at 11 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. And they helped me identify all of the target groups and gave me some information that the adults didn't have that would be helpful in us implementing our crisis response. So 2 hours later, when I met with our adult crisis team, I was able to provide some very important information. And that particular day, on Monday, we had 20 crisis responders from area schools, all trained in that CISM model. So I have just one more thing to say, because there's one more person talking.
Roberta.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Can I do have to move on though.
Yeah. I was trying to talk as fast as I could.
I know. I really appreciate your perspective, because I think what you're sharing is so valuable, because a lot of it is that, you know, climate and culture and setting the stage before and helping to head off problems. And obviously, then we talk to Ann Arbor and talk about, you know, what do we do to get ourselves prepared for crisis response? And then we asked Shannon to join us today. And Shannon, are you currently president of the Michigan School Counselors Association? Did I get that right?
Oh, I'm president-elect, I think, until May.
All right. Well, fantastic. And thank you for taking that leadership role in your association. And I know you were going to share with us some thoughts about, you know, okay, the crisis has already happened. Did I lose you?
Yeah, just a little bit. Yeah,
Okay,
so
I'm sorry.
I think this is my colleague, Rebecca Moon here, extraordinaire. And we wanted to kind of focus on, we knew we were speaking to administrators, and we wanted to focus on that 3 to 5 days after a crisis and critical incident, because I feel like sometimes that's an area that is missed. You know, I'm not an expert in crisis response or anything like that, but I think we have between us some good experience to share some thoughts that we have with you on taking care of your staff, your students, and the culture in your buildings after a critical incident. Is it okay if I share my screen?
I think we've enabled that for you. Good. Perfect.
There we go. Okay, so just to give you a little heads up on some of my background, we've gotten some resources from the American School Association of School Counselors, and also a couple summers ago, right as this summer, the first COVID shutdown, I was part of a team under Scott Hutchins that worked with the Michigan Department of Ed to create a mental health toolkit. And so I've included both of these resource sets, you know, to share. And then this one I thought was pretty cool to share. It's got a lot of one-pagers to pass out to staff, to give them a little bit more of a theoretical background on what children might be going through, signs, symptoms of trauma, and how to help as an adult in your building. One of the things that I just wanted to emphasize is that after a critical incident, I have seen you know, kind of a push to get things back to normal. And I, you know, just want to make sure we emphasize that the children need that time to process what has happened and adjust to that crisis before they move on. Essentially, there's no learning that's going to happen, no matter how amazing your curriculum is, if, you know, they're not ready for it, they're not ready to learn. This is something I think you're an expert in, is taking care of our staff.
So yeah, and, just as principals, step one, take care of your staff, because if our staff is not being taken care of, I know, and I feel like even just now, staff's a little heightened, and so therefore it's harder to manage students' behavior. But step one is taking care of staff, and those days after, allowing time in person, checking in one-on-one, letting staff know how they're going to be supported. I think just like with our students, our staff needs to know, like, okay, if I need a break, or if I need to talk, what's the process? And so giving staff that information and that permission to do that, I think is really, really important. And I feel like just what we've seen is encouraging staff to reach out for help when needed. I know our principal does that often, but staff doesn't always take them up on that. So the constant reminders and the one-on-ones are really important, and providing breaks if needed. Like we just had a recent incident, and the teacher really needed a break. We recognized it and stepped in, and the principal stepped in. And so I think we just have to, that's step one, is how to take care of his staff. And I know as principals carry a lot, and so delegating that a little bit too to help.
Yeah, over communicate to staff. I've seen a lot of, when you're in a crisis situation and you're sitting down and you're trying to think, okay, how is this debriefing going to happen? Who's closest? How are we going to do this? I think people get missed, and it's just important to make sure that all stakeholders are over communicated with, honestly and simply, about what's going on, because they need that time to process also. So one of the things that we like to promote in our association, along with the Mental Health Coalition, is that you have mental health professionals in your building to help with this aftercare. And, we need our mental health professionals. Children spend most of their time in school. They're comfortable here. We do lunch every day. So they see us, we're scrubbing tables and talking to everybody. And, it's a safe environment. And so this is also the environment where we have access. We do a lot of formal, informal, screeners. So we checking in with students, and we send a Google form out to every single kid, just to see, how are you? What's going on? What are some of your thoughts? What is it that you need from us, as for support? We're just constantly providing opportunities for them to get communication in with people that can help them. This is just some, basics on the impact of death on children. I know a lot of you principals probably feel like you have some frequent flyers, and that you're making, 6 figures out there to work with 5 different kids, and you can name them, right? But those are, those are the 5 kids, or the 10 kids, or the 20 that they already have a lot of pre-existing, issues and concerns. And when any kind of incident happens, whether they're connected to that closely or not, you're going to see some heightened feelings and reactions. And so just, predicting that that's going to happen, and knowing that, okay, I'm going to have to take care of these children. I don't know as much, in the reaction in high school as, we're middle school counselors, but middle schoolers, anytime you bring up death in general, they really are still trying to conceptualize death, and, and it's hard for them to think about that. So this can trigger kind of a waterfall effect anytime you bring up death with middle school children. We all know this. I think that the impact of trauma on learning, you can see it. One of the biggest things I think I see is the hyperarousal. You're going to see that behavior, as hyperactivity or hypervigilance. And really that might be the cue that, okay, this kid probably needs some more help. He needs to decompress. He needs to come on in, see somebody, chat. I just included some signs of trauma. This is basic stuff you would pass out, if you are debriefing. Oops, I lost my cursor, sorry. These are some changes in behavior that can happen after a critical incident or trauma that a child has been through, specifically ages 12 to 18. So there can be a lot of anxiety and depression, but it also, when kids are processing trauma, they can, especially high schoolers, kind of have some extra destructive behavior and risk-taking choices that can be scary for parents and teachers. And just know that parents and teachers often underestimate symptoms. I think that making sure your entire staff knows the symptoms of trauma, not just the team handling the response. And then to see that some of those internalizing behaviors are hard to see. It's hard, they don't stick out like a sore thumb, but that quiet kid might still be internalizing and not performing as well. Maybe he's not acting out, but all of a sudden you see grades drop, or you see some changes that weren't there before. Adult distress makes children distress harder to see. And what I mean by that is that when the adult that is supposed to be in the caretaking and protecting position is having a hard time holding themselves together, children will tend to step up and take over that role. And that's not what we want, so we want to make sure that when you're scanning your building, the adults that are having a hard time managing their stress, that they're going to need you to step in and get some support. I think a lot of adults feel like we got to get back to normal and we got to return to the routine. But I think that also, giving your staff the permission to pause and process. This is something you guys have probably all seen, just identifying, high risk for emotional distress. This would be who's closest to the person or persons who have passed on. I think two of the biggest ways you can educate your staff to support students is by listening and how to respond. And so one of the things that we do here, if you want to talk about circle check-ins, it helps with our school connectedness. So
yeah, just giving, giving teachers permission to take some time in their classes to check in with students. And I know that in some, depending on where your school is in regards to the comfort level with students, with teachers doing that, it's modeling it for the teachers as well at a PLC or your staff meetings, doing a quick circle check-in with the staff to get the temperature of the room, and really encouraging staff to do that with their students as well, to build that community. And just listening, sometimes it's just being there, remembering that silence is okay. I think teachers, even in the days after a crisis, or just even in the trauma-filled world that we're in, just constant reminders of these little tools and strategies, I think are helpful for them personally and for dealing with student behaviors.
Yeah, I mean, for example, just, with the tragedy in the news, I know a lot of you are experiencing heightened behaviors in your building in response to that. So are we. We have, some super inappropriate behavior, but we also have some anxious, behavior. And I'm inviting one of our students in for lunch, and we're just sitting next to each other. That's it. That's my intervention. We're just hanging, we're eating lunch together. That proximity and just being with him is helping with that decompression and that de-escalation. So things don't have to be complicated. When staff and administrators are responding to students, when you're rephrasing what somebody has said or paraphrasing that, just to validate the child's experience, and to make sure they know that they're not to blame. And I think children, especially younger ages through 16, are going to feel some form of guilt and shame. We've lost a student by suicide before, and I think a lot of the kids felt guilt and shame because any name or any type of negative comment they had ever made to this child, heightened that sense of guilt and shame. I love what Roberta said about having a PALS program, check in, check out. doing a dot or connectedness survey in your buildings to see how students are connected to each other and to the adults in your building. And it's just important that those kind of steps are brought into the building so that kids have those opportunities to feel connected. And once again, when staff's talking and responding to students, just to keep the answers simple, fact-based, and honest. I think some of the things that get a little bit more tricky after a critical incident is supporting those students that have a little lengthier symptoms, so to speak. Like these symptoms are presenting themselves for a longer period of time, and every child's grief process is different. And so I know in our building and in many buildings that we've worked in, it's hard for staff to allow students to come out of the building. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, but I mean, I think, as an administrator, just making sure that staff know they can leave without explanation. Here's the protocol on how we're going to do that. If a student is asking to call home, sometimes that makes them feel safe to be connected with an adult for reassurance. This is how we're going to do that. But a lot of time, teachers just need to hear it's okay to back off on curriculum. It's okay to take this time out and do it. It's okay. They just need the permission to do it. And then you'll see that kind of waterfall effect also. And then allow some private time for teacher and counselor time. We're noticing a lot of heightened issues with staff in our building, and just, want to make sure that we're there for them too. And like we said earlier, grief and trauma doesn't have a set timeline, and it affects all domains of a child's life, and it's subjective. Everybody deals with this differently. So death is, a stressful personal experience. And so these are just some things to just, look at and be mindful of. And one thing I want you guys to pay attention to is recognition that self-care is important, and it must be modeled from the top down. That's you guys, must be modeled. So if you're the principal and you're dealing with all this stuff, I look at my principals and I think, wow, they're taking care of everybody. And I'll be honest, nobody's taking care of them. They don't get breaks. They don't eat. They don't get breaks. They're just on. And they're dealing with all this stuff, and they're taking all these phone calls and all these emails, and they have all this stress on them. You need to be stepping up and saying, tonight, I'm not answering my emails past 8 p.m. or I am going to go watch a football game, or this is what I'm going to do to take care of myself tonight. And you need to say it out loud. You need to promote it. Like, this is what I'm doing. I'm the leader and I'm going to take care of myself. And that recognition of self-care will trickle down to your staff, because we see this. Our administrators, everybody talks about the stress that the teachers have. You guys have it times two. So that's our 2 cents.
I really appreciate you, really emphasizing that, because I don't think that's something at MASSP I'm constantly talking to our memberships about, and talking about the fact that, you've got to walk away every once in a while. And even the school day, if you're just really amped up, taking a walk around the building, get away from your desk, put down your social media, even if it's briefly, to be able to do that. And, as we're kind of wrapping up here, I hear a couple of things. And I think the biggest challenges this year more than ever before is the fact that so much of what we do, whether it's in prevention or, following an incident, is based on relationships. And when you haven't had the kids in your building, building those relationships over time, it just makes it really challenging to be able to do that. So I think everybody needs to, that focus on circles, that focus on relationships, I think is really important. And then I think the other thing that many of you touched on, every principal or every parent in the state has asked their child what training has gone on at school. So I think being able to, identify what type of training that has happened and reassure and rest the minds of parents at home, I think that's really critical as well. So I really do want to thank all of you for joining us today. It's hard to cover a broad topic in a short period of time. So I appreciate all of you, your willingness to do that. And as mentioned, we will be sharing a recording of this presentation and calling on all of you to join us at EdCon this summer to do breakout presentations, because I think that people would really benefit from these really practical strategies that all of you share. I thank you for your time. I know how busy you are and how stressful things are. So thank you much for helping others at a time where you're stressed yourself. Thank you.